Hello everybody, in this video I'm going to be covering measurements of economic activity such as GDP and GNI and different ways of getting these calculations on a national level. So this is going to be largely a continuation from my previous video about circular flow of income. So if you haven't checked that out, please be sure to do so, as it will help you understand this video a lot better. So this is about topic macroeconomics 3.1 in IB economics. So let's get cracking. So GDP you've probably heard of before. It stands for gross domestic product, and it is the total value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a year, regardless of who owns the factors of production. Then we have something called GNI, is the total value of all income received by members / residents of a country in a year, regardless of where the factors of production originated from. So what we see here in common is that they're both measurements in a year, right? So GDP and GNI are measures of economic activity. So they have to have an international standard for how long the time frame is. Because if you measure economic activity and, let's say, production in a day, it's obviously going to be less than in a year. So you have to have it constant for countries to be able to compare with each other, which is one of the important parts of measuring economic activity. So looking here, we have the word final goods and services. So final good and service is something that's intended for its final user and not used as an intermediary good or service. So an intermediary good or service is something that's used to produce another good or service. Say, steel rod would not be used for a final consumer, right? It would be used to produce, let's say, a car, something like that. And the total value regards the fact that everything is added up together, and regardless of who owns factors of production. This is quite an important part because this definition is quite overlooked in early economics and general knowledge itself. So ownership of factors of production means that international owners and domestic owners are regarded the same when it comes to the output they produced in a country. So let's say a US person owns a business, let's say a McDonald's in Australia. Despite the McDonald's being owned by a US person, the output it produced is within Australia, so it'll count towards Australia's GDP. Same thing here. And GNI, the total value of all income received by members / residents of the country. So income, you may recall, are the returns to the provision of factors of production. So you have land, labor, capital, and rent. Enterprise, you get rent, wages, interest, and profit. So because you get that, you have GNI being equal to the total income received, but also you've got to consider this point where it's regardless where the factors of production originated from. This one's also talking about where the factors of production are placed, right? So sometimes you could be an Australian who owns a subway in America, say. So it's like the roles are reversed from my GDP example. And you receive, say, profit because you're the entrepreneur. And that profit, even though it's from output produced in the US, the income still counts towards Australia because you're the one receiving the profit itself. All right, and GDP does not equal GNI because in general terms the income is something that flows a lot internationally, so you have to adjust for it. So GNI we say is equal to GDP plus net income from abroad. So GNI equals GDP generally because when we look at the circular flow of income model, the income earned by the households who provide goods and services, provide factors of production, is going to be equal to the value of all goods and services produced. So the returns going to be equal to the value of goods and services produced, but that's in a country only, right? So, but this is considering all income received, regardless of where they come from. So we have to adjust by adding net income from abroad, right? So that's going to be income earned from abroad versus income sent abroad. And these are generally in the form of remittances and profit repatriation. Remittances are when residents of a country receive income from family members or relatives who are working abroad. So this is evident in third world countries where a particular family member could leave to a richer country, work there, and send back money because you earn a lot more in these first world countries than third world. And profit repatriation is when people let's say, own businesses and other stuff in, like just corporations internationally, and you get the profit earned. So Elon Musk could earn something in Australia. He lives in America. He still gets the money from that ownership. So other important aspects are nominal GDP and GNI and real GDP and GNI. So nominal means in terms of current prices. So each year prices change due to inflation, deflation, and just general fluctuation in the price level of things in the economy. You may notice, let's say, like after the pandemic, there could have been inflation in your country, such as with Australia, and you may have noticed that the price of vegetables are on the rise. So we have to use the current prices when you do this. However, when prices rise, the value of all goods and services increase, but that does not necessarily mean that we're producing more. So we need a more accurate representation of whether we are producing more, right? So compared to the past, right? So like literally producing more, not that the value itself goes up. Because let's say a car cost 10K in 2010, and then in 2020 it cost 20K, right? Because we produce, let's say we produced two cars back in 2010, which would have which would have mean the GDP would have been 20K, but we produced one car in 2020, which would have been it's 20K again. So does that mean the GDP and the value, does that mean we literally produce the same amount? No, because we produce two cars as opposed to one, so it's actually worse off. So we need to divide by do some calculation to get real GDP. I'll go over that later in another video. And other important parts of GDP are GDP per capita, which is just GDP divided by the total population. And this is used to provide how much resources how much output is allocated to an individual, to the average member of a country. And GNI per capita is about the how much income is received by the average member of a country, and this is quite a good indication of living standards, because the higher the GNI per capita, the better, the greater the ability of people to buy stuff. Right? Now, going into measuring economic activity, the three main methods are expenditure, income, and output approach. Expenditure approach for GDP is just adding C plus I plus G plus NX. Watch the circular flow of income video if you don't know what that means. So that's consumption expenditure plus income plus investment, and plus government expenditure plus NX. So this is the circular flow of income, the closed system, and the inner system. And this is the investment, so the injection, government expenditure injection. And net exports is the funny one, because it's going to be equal to exports minus imports, so it's going to be injection minus leakage. Income approach for GDP is adding the returns to the provision of factors of production, so rent plus wages plus interest plus profit. Profit is represented as pi. So here we don't need to make adjustments for the net income from abroad, because it already takes into account remittances. You get like wages sent to you, and also profit from capital ownership, profit repatriation. So it's already counted for. That's why you don't have to count the net income from abroad here. And output approach is just multiplying the price by quantity of everything you produced and adding that up together. Okay, so GDP and GNI are measures of national income, because we want to measure living standards generally. So higher the GDP, higher the GNI, generally the better living standards of a country. That doesn't always follow, and sometimes GDP and GNI can underestimate standards of living, because it does not consider underground markets and unrecorded economic activity. Say a plumber buys, so let's say a plumber actually works on his own pipes. He doesn't count that as something that's produced, but it does come to us as living standards, because it's helping that plumber live a better life. It does not include output sold that's not sold in markets, so sometimes people could sell with each other, so economic activity is not by itself. And also subsistence agriculture, because you might produce wheat and rice for yourself, and that does not go towards the living standards, because it's not recorded economic activity. It does not take into account how goods and services are improved, because goods and services could improve over the time, even though the price changes, price stays the same. So the value of the goods and services may stay the same, so it won't change GDP and GNI, but it will actually help go to living standards, because let's say compare a car in the 1980s versus a car in the 2020s. The same price car in terms of real terms would be would be more comfortable and faster, so it does contribute more to the standards of living, even though it may not be reflected in the GDP. Also, another thing is that it does not take into account other factors of living, so it's like education, health, life expectancy, all that. We need to look at that later. And it may overestimate standards of living because it does not take into account negative externalities in the production of goods and services, and it does not take about depletion of natural resources. We also have other measurements of economic activity that do take into account of these. We'll go into them soon. And also they may under or overestimate because they do not consider what the output of goods and services consist of. So like they don't consider whether they're military goods versus public goods. You'll understand that soon. If you've already covered all the topics, you'd understand what I mean by that. And they also disregard the distribution of income in terms of who gets what, and like even output itself, who gets what. So it could be that GDP per capita, even though it's an average, it could be that so many people have a really high GDP and so many people have a low GDP proportion allotted to them. So that would be bad because that's inequality. And so there's also another factor, which is that price levels can change, be different in countries. So let's say in the US, if you want to buy a McDonald's meal, it will probably cost more than say in India. And so, like in terms of real value of money and exchange rates, so we have these things called purchasing power parities, which we'll go into later, and that's how we adjust for these factors when making comparisons internationally. Two important measures of economic activity you'll probably need to know are the HDI, which we'll go into in other topics as well. And the HDI is going to be equal to the GNI per capita, or the income per person, and considering health and education. So it's one of those measures of economic activity and the level or the standards of a country with these three dimensions. So just memorize these three and remember. So income per capita, health, education. Right, green GDP is considering the environment, so it's going to be the GDP minus the value of environmental destruction, and that's going to take into account whether the environment was destroyed, and which is an important factor when you think about quality of life and future sustainability. So other than that, that's basically all you need to know about topic 3.1 in the 2022 syllabus. I might have, if I've missed anything, please let me know in the comments and I'll make a video just for you. And thank you guys for watching. It really helps out the channel. I don't get many views. And please drop a like if you enjoyed, and just leave any comments on anything I can improve on and I'll take it. Thanks guys. Have a good one.